My terrific honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who has come back to us. And everybody's really looking forward to Dr. Gershon Baskin to talk with us today on a subject called What to Do When Enemies Don't Talk. Dr. Baskin was the initiator and the person responsible for the secret direct back channel between Israel and the Hamas that successfully negotiated the release of abducted Israeli soldier Gilead Shalit. His book on the secret, 2013, The Secret Negotiations, was published in Hebrew in June and English in October of 2013. In November 2018, Baskin's book, In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine, was published by Vanderbilt University Press, and in November 2020, the book came out in Arabic in Jordan and will soon be published in Portuguese in Brazil and Spanish in Mexico. He has been awarded the Histadrut Prize for Peace in 1996, the Turkish Foreign Policy Institute Peace in 2004, the Tribute of Honor and Courage from the World Movement of Democracy in 2004, and the Search for Common Ground Journalist Award for Middle East Journalism in 2005 and 2007. Speaks Hebrew, English, and Arabic. Couple of extra notes. Since 2005 in February, he's had a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post under the title of Encountering Peace. His weekly column is also published in Arabic in the Palestinian Daily newspaper and in Hebrew. He's also involved with something called Humans Without Borders, which helps Israeli volunteers helping Palestinians get medical help. And a quote about our speaker is, Gershon Baskin is one of the outstanding originators of peace initiatives in our area. This is based on a deep belief in the qualities of human affinity, human dignity, and selflessness. He is a pluralist and recognizes that social behavior is essential to building peace through participation from the bottom up. It is my delight and pleasure, and I look forward to it. And also, he has agreed that when we finish, he'll stay after, maybe for a half an hour, to handle Q&As. Thank you so much, Gershon, and a warm, warm welcome.
Thank you very much. And good evening from Jerusalem. It's now about 20 minutes after 6 here in the evening on a Sunday. We had our first rain today, which is a blessing, the beginning of our rainy season. My book, by the way, has been published already in Hebrew, and Vanderbilt University notified me last week that it just came out as an audiobook, which is available if you go to audiobooks and look for Vanderbilt University Press during the first week. It's available for free, so you should try and get it. This is a really, really difficult subject filled with lots of dilemmas, because when enemies don't speak is the norm. Enemies don't speak, they fight, they shoot, they kill. What do you do when you have an enemy and there are very few choices of what to do? I've been involved in trying to build bridges between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians for the last 44 years. And I have always adopted for myself a policy which I call, I'm willing to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to me. That oftentimes involves, in conflict situations like here, breaking the law. Until 1994, it was illegal for Israelis to talk to members of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the organization representing the Palestinian people. I broke that law repeatedly from 1988 until it became legal to talk to the PLO. I met with them abroad. I spoke to them by telephone. I conducted public appearances with senior representatives of the PLO. In 1990, I traveled illegally to Tunisia to meet with the leadership of the PLO, all that time risking that I could be arrested and imprisoned. I wasn't, because apparently enough people on the Israeli side who knew that what I was doing, and the people who needed to know knew, decided that it was more important for me to continue talking to them than to arrest me. But the personal price that I did pay for was that for 4 years, I was on the Israeli security list. And every time I traveled out of the country or came back to the country, I was stopped, I was searched, I was stripped. At times, my belongings were taken from me. I was told on numerous occasions that I would not be allowed to leave the country. That never happened. But the first time that it happened, I was in shock when they told me to sit down, that I'm not allowed to leave the country. And I knew it was all the time because I was talking to our enemy. Fortunately, in Israel, there were enough people at that time who were interested enough to make contact with me and to talk to me from the Israeli side. I remember early in 1989, I think it was, I was called to the research department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they brought me into a kind of a warehouse, a storage room, not even into a normal meeting room. And I sat with 2 senior officials of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they opened up the discussion by saying, this meeting is not taking place. And if you report to anyone that it did take place, we will deny it. And then they went on to ask me all kinds of questions about my talks with members of the PLO, because they were curious and intelligent enough to know that it was important that Israel have some first-hand reflections on what the enemy is saying. The same thing is the case today. It is illegal to talk to Hamas. Hamas is designated both in Israel, by the European Union, by the United States, by Canada, by Australia, as a terrorist organization. But there are 2.5 to 3 million people living next door to us in Gaza, ruled by Hamas. Hamas has a massive presence, political presence, in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, where I live in the city of Jerusalem. They're our enemy, they're a terrorist organization, and it is illegal to talk to them. And as I said, I talk to anyone who's willing to talk to me, and I take the risk that I could be arrested. I was, prior to and during the war that took place here between Israel and Hamas in 2014, invited twice by the Israeli secret police, the Shin Bet, to come. They once came knocking at my door at 7 o'clock in the morning, 2 policemen, and told me that I had to come with them, and they took me to a police station an hour outside of Jerusalem, where I was left waiting until someone from the Shin Bet called me and went up to the 3rd floor of this police station, where this young Shin Bet agent pulled out a computer-written piece of paper, read me a note saying that I might be breaking the law by talking to the PLO, talking to Hamas, at which point I basically told him to take the note and shove it up his you-know-what, because all the talks that I was having at the time were seeking to achieve a ceasefire, seeking to prevent a war in which people would be killed. And all my conversations were being reported to at least 3 Israeli generals. In fact, it was one of those generals who told the Israeli police to have me brought in and warned. And then when the war was starting and we were still trying to achieve a ceasefire, I once again got called to another Shin Bet office and was read a piece of paper by some young Shin Bet agent, who I also told him to take that note and stick it in. I was never arrested. And I communicate regularly with Israeli officials and inform them what I'm doing. I'm in the process now of trying to arrange to spend several days with one of the Hamas leaders in a 3rd country, where we would take some Airbnb somewhere in private and 3 days and try and brainstorm of how do we change the dynamics between Israel and Hamas. I know this Hamas person for 15 years already. We've spoken well over 1,000 times over the last 15 years. We met face-to-face twice in Egypt. We met face-to-face twice in Gaza before it was illegal for Israelis to go to Gaza. And I know that if I go and meet with him in some European country somewhere, that we can get him a visa to travel to or someplace else, that I will be breaking the law once again. And this is even more risky. He's also taking risk because he doesn't have any authorization to deal with an Israeli directly. The official policy of Hamas is not to talk to Israelis at all about anything. And all the negotiations that usually take place between enemies, in this case, Israel and Hamas, is usually done through a third party. Egypt is usually the mediator between Israel and Hamas, and Egypt is empowered by Israel and Hamas to negotiate. And for 8 years now, there are the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers who were killed in 2014. And there are 2 Israeli civilians who are both medicated, mentally ill people who crossed into Gaza by themselves. And for 8 years, negotiations have been going on through the Egyptians and through others in trying to negotiate a deal, and no deal has worked out. And this really hinders any chance of changing the dynamics in the relationship. But here we're in this situation where Israel and Hamas mutually do not recognize each other. Hamas's policy is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Israel views Hamas as a terrorist organization that has no right to exist. These are arch enemies. And I maintain the policy. I'm not an official. I have sat in the office of Israeli officials, both in the Ministry of Defense and in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, sitting with members of Knesset, members of the Israeli government, and talking to people from Hamas on my telephone and offering these Israeli officials to take the phone. And I remember one time very vividly, the Israeli government minister, I was sitting with his face turned red and started pushing his hands like this. No, don't go near the phone. Like, what would happen if he picked up the phone and spoke to this person? But this is a big dilemma, and I understand it. Let's put it in a modern day context. Should President Zelensky of the Ukraine pick up the phone and call President Putin? What would he say? What can you say? Other than making his demands that he makes all the time, that the Russians invaded Ukraine and they need to withdraw their forces from all the territories they conquered, including the Crimea, which they conquered years ago? What would Mr. Zelensky say to Mr. Putin? What would President Biden say if he picked up the phone now and spoke to Putin? What would he say? Could he say anything other than threatening Putin? We all view President Putin a dictator, a murderer, a conqueror, an invader, an occupier. Is it right? Is it ethical to pick up the phone and talk to Putin? I don't have an answer. I was discussing this earlier with a Norwegian friend who works with Palestinians. He's actually a member of your organization in Norway. There's a Norwegian branch, and he is involved there. And the bottom line of our discussion was that sometimes maybe the only alternative you have is to fight. Could someone have picked up the phone to Adolf Hitler and try to reason with him, to talk to him? Sometimes there are enemies where it's not even ethical to try to talk to them. And this is the dilemma, I think, that we face. For most Israelis, talking to Hamas is unethical. They are dedicated to our destruction. They don't recognize our right to exist. The same thing for Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also from the perspective of the Palestinian supporters of Hamas or the Lebanese supporters of Hezbollah, who think that Israel doesn't have a right to exist and Israel doesn't recognize their right to exist, and their policy is non-engagement and non-discussion and no talking and no negotiations. But how do you break out of that when your enemy, your enemy is not only dedicated to your destruction, your enemy is actually killing you. Israel kills Palestinians every week. And the Hamas never stopped trying to kill Israelis because they're Jewish. When can you say it's okay to talk? So I don't have an answer. I think this is a dilemma that everyone needs to deal with. Certainly leaders who take responsibility need to deal with it. I can think of ways of approaching it. One of the ways of doing it is by using people like me. I'm not an official. I can go and engage, and they can engage with me on both sides. That's one of the ways. Another way that was done during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union is that third parties got involved, like the Finns, the whole Helsinki process that took place of holding talks between Israelis, American and Soviet nuclear scientists and physicists who were meeting on a regular basis in Helsinki during the whole period of the Cold War and trying to get the two sides level to reason about arms control, about
Okay, hold on. It looks like it's frozen.
Gershon, can you move around a little? Maybe
Sure.
relive. There you go.
Am I stuck? Okay.
You got
The
it.
internet might not be stable. Okay. I just got a note saying my internet is not stable. So I hope it
Yeah.
is to engage third parties, to ask third parties to make contact, to use a third party to talk to the other side, to see to what extent they're willing to talk and meet and discuss. I have proposed over and over again in our context here between Israel and our Arab neighbors that we establish some kind of hotline, some kind of, the secret red phone that's next to the president's bed, which is more today a mechanism than an actual physical telephone. But when things are hot, imagine if on the day that Russia invaded the Ukraine, someone could have picked up the phone to Mr. Putin and say, hey, let's try and reason here. Let's see what you want to achieve, why are you doing what you're doing? What are you trying to achieve before you start killing people? Perhaps the whole situation could be different. If President Biden would pick up the phone and call President Xi in China, rather than engaging in a trade war, to propose that we sit down and talk and reason and figure out what each side has against the other and see if we can come to some kind of accommodation before we escalate and get to the point where we really can't talk to each other. And even when you escalate and get to the point where you really can't talk to each other, we have to have someone who can intervene and talk, because most conflicts that I know don't end until you talk. I don't know how to end conflicts without sitting at a table and negotiating. And negotiations require compromise. So wouldn't it be much better if we could arrive at compromises before a lot of people are killed and a lot of property is destroyed and lives are destroyed? It's not always possible. Sometimes you need leaders of such moral character that politicians usually don't meet those standards. And there are very few leaders around the world who have the moral standards that Nelson Mandela had, for example, who was not only willing to engage the enemy, but he said at the point in his life when he was going to be a very important leader, that we are not going to ask for revenge against these people who treated us so badly and killed us and denied us our basic human rights. There are very few leaders around the world. In the world today where we have trends, look what happened in Sweden, where the second largest political party in Sweden today is a right-wing, racist, anti-immigration, pseudo-fascist party. The new prime minister of Italy is a descendant of the political party of Mussolini, of the fascist in Italy. We have elections in 9 days from now in Israel, where it looks like the third largest party in Israel are going to be right-wing, racist, fascist, homophobic, religious people who see the left in Israel, who see non-Jews as their enemy, have a platform of expulsion of Arabs from this country, and they are likely to be the third largest party elected in our elections in 9 days from today. Sometimes I think about the fact that I'm willing to talk to Hamas, who's dedicated to my destruction. It's much easier for me to talk to Hamas than it is for me to talk to these racist Israelis who are running in the election. And here's a dilemma as well. We need to talk to them. I often tell Palestinians who boycott discussions with Israelis, any Israelis, I express to them, I don't understand how you're going to end the Israeli occupation over the Palestinian people and get your liberation and freedom by not talking to me. I don't understand how that advances their cause. They need to really engage with the most right-wing Israelis, the Israeli settlers who are living in occupied territory. And I understand it's difficult for them addressing the people who are their real enemy, but a lot of Palestinians won't even talk to me. and I support the Palestinian cause and freedom and liberation and against Israeli occupation for my whole life. So these are really personal dilemmas. They're political dilemmas. They're dilemmas of how you best achieve your goals. But I'll end here for a discussion with the basic bottom line is that I believe that we need to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to us, and that's for me the only condition that I make on talking. We have, when Hamas was elected here in elections in 2006, the United States and the international community set a bar of 3 preconditions for Hamas. That was denouncing violence, in other words, saying that they don't have a right to an armed struggle, recognizing the state of Israel, and adhering to the Oslo agreements that they opposed from the very beginning. Those 3 conditions will never be met by Hamas, which means that there's never going to be an opportunity to talk to the arch enemy. For me, as I said, the only condition I make is if they're willing to talk to me. And I think that's the starting point that we have to accept. So I would say with the current dilemmas that we have in the world today, what would happen if Zelensky called Putin, or if Biden called Putin, or if Putin called Zelensky, or if Putin called Biden? What would happen? What could happen? It may be what we need to do is find this third party who can talk to both of them. Some have tried and not succeeded so far, but this is obviously a case in point of an active, acute war where people are being killed today, where from my perspective, there's the good side and the bad side. I don't know about all of you. I imagine that you two share with me that the Ukrainians are the one who deserve our support, but still perhaps the best way that we can support them is to find a way to end the war. And maybe that's what we really need to put in front of us and think about, rather than just continuing to arm the Ukraine to be able to fight the war better, which is something that I think is a moral responsibility that we need to do. But at the same time, I think we need to find a way to end the war, which is the ultimate good that we need to do. So I will stop here with this kind of introduction and open it for discussion.